A much more common way to use the diminished scale is over a dominant seventh chord that has a flat 9. And in fact, if we really investigate this scale, you probably have to write out this scale, and it's kind of strange that we're going to use a diminished scale not built on the root of our chord. So that's why I played the A flat diminished scale the first time around, because we're going to play it over a G7 chord, and those are the two that go together. So on a G7, we're going to go up a half step and play an A flat diminished scale. A short timeout with a rant here. Some people refer to two different diminished scales. They say one of them starts with a whole step and it goes whole half, whole half, whole half, and repeats. And then they think there's another scale called the half whole diminished scale that starts with a half step and then goes whole step, half step, whole step. I don't think that's actually true. If you took that logic, you could say, oh, it's a major scale and it starts with a half step. Well, it doesn't. The major scale starts with a whole step, it goes whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. It doesn't sometimes start with a half step. If it started with a half step, it needs a new name. It's not a major scale anymore. So in the same way, a diminished scale goes whole, half, whole, half, whole, half. If you say, oh, it's a half whole diminished scale, it's not really a diminished scale anymore. It's something else. So, or maybe it's sort of a mode of the diminished scale or something like that. So what I think the reason this confusion comes about is people play this stuff and then theoreticians come along and name it later. But I think sometimes it doesn't fit so neatly into a nice little package, so they get kind of jammed up and they end up making up stuff that's maybe not exactly true. So I believe there's only one diminished scale, and it starts with a whole step and goes whole step, half step, whole step, half step. We are going to use it not starting on the root for that reason. So when you have a G7 chord and you want to play a diminished sound over it, you're going to play an A flat diminished scale. So you could think of it as a diminished scale built on the flat 9. You could also think of it as a diminished scale built on the third of the chord, because A flat diminished is B diminished, is D diminished, is F diminished. And if you look at those notes in terms of a G7 chord, A flat's the flat 9, B is the third, D is the fifth, and F is the flat 7th. So those are all great chord tones to start from. So that's another way to think of this. When you see a dominant 7th chord, you could just say, well, I'm going to play a diminished scale starting on the flatted 7th, which again gets you away from that root sound all the time. So that might be kind of a cool way to think about it when you've got a G7 chord and you want a diminished sound on it. Pardon my thumb over. I don't really do this in real life, but Tal Farlow did. Tal Farlow apparently had gigantic hands. I can't really get to this chord, so I rely on my bass player to play the G that's down here, but this is the voicing that I might use for a G13 with a flat 9. That's going F, B, E, and A flat up here. So flat 7, third, 13th, and flat 9, and the G is the root. So this is a typical kind of sound that you're going to use to play the diminished scale over. In fact, if you wrote out the A flat diminished scale over a G7 chord, you would find it's got the root, a flat 9, a sharp 9, a major third, a sharp 11, a fifth, a 13th, a flat 7, and then we're back on the root. So it's kind of a strange scale. It has two 9s, both flat and sharp 9, the major third, sharp 11, fifth, 13th, flat 7, and we're back to the root. So when you see a dominant chord, if it says G7 flat 9, diminished might be a good choice over that. If it says G7 sharp 9, diminished might be a good choice. If it says G7 sharp 11, you could play diminished. If it says G13 sharp 11, you could play that. The flat 9 and sharp 9 are really the typical notes of the diminished scale, so if it doesn't refer to any kind of ninth, there's some other choices to make. Like normally if I saw a G13 sharp 11 chord, diminished might not be the very first choice that I would make, especially if it's the last chord of a tune, or I might toggle between diminished and something else. But that's the fun thing about jazz, right? There's no rule. As John Schofield said when I saw him in a clinic, dominant chords are hard because you can play everything on a dominant chord. What he meant is you can play a flat 9 and you can play a natural 9 on a dominant chord, or you can play a sharp 9, you can play a major 3rd, you can play the 4th, you can play the sharp 4th or the sharp 11th, you can play the 5th, you can play everything. And what John Scofield said, dominant chords are hard, you can play everything except the major 7th, and I play that sometimes too. So when a dominant chord comes up, there's a lot of choices that you can make. Maybe the piano player or the comper, guitar player or vibes player, or whoever you're playing with, they might lay down a strong sound of one type or another. Like this G13 flat 9 sound is very, very typical of the diminished sound. So if I hear somebody comping playing that sound, the first thing I'm going to go for is diminished, because it has all the things that a diminished chord should have, the natural 13 and the flat 9 in particular. Depending on what the comper is doing, they might lay it out for you with a real strong sound, or they may leave it a little more vague and let you fill that in. So if it's somebody you're playing with for the first time, hopefully they leave it a little bit vague. They kind of check out what you're doing as a soloist, and then the next time through the tune, support what you're doing. You know, that's what good jazz players do, is they listen to each other, and it's kind of hard to do. It's hard to play and listen at the same time, but the more you do it, you may even find it hard to recognize some of these sounds, because a 13 with a flat 9 might sound similar to you as a flat 13 and a flat 9. If you get those sounds in your ears, you'll be able to pick them out, and you'd be surprised at how good your ears can get. But our ears, I think, can all get better. So we've got our G7 or G13 with a flat 9, and we're going to go up a half step and play diminished on it. Or, so you could say it's a diminished scale built off the flat 9, but you could also say it's built off the 3rd or the 5th or the flat 7. If you're playing in a sort of shape orientation and you use this voicing, it might be kind of cool to play your diminished scale off the flat 7, which is going to be in the same position as like where your root on the 6th string would be. So if you had a chord progression that was like, you could play on this G13 flat 9